Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and like I'll do sometimes, I've come prepared today with my little list of things to do. And it's not so difficult. I know that I'm here to feed what I refer to as my African night crawlers, the ANCs. And you'll even see what I wrote here in parentheses, or whatever they are, because a lot of people have called it into question whether they're really African night crawlers or not. They might not be. But when they were provided to me as cocoons originally, they were supposedly African night crawlers. Who knows, the population could have gotten infiltrated by some other worm, overrun, replaced basically, and who knows. But until I know otherwise, until I do some sort of a formal identification of what they are, I'm referring to them as African night crawlers. And the only other things that are pretty easy to remember that I could have certainly kept in my head were the ages of these bins. The older of the two, up there on the shelf in the VERMIBAG tote, is 94 days of age at this point, so a little bit over 3 months of age. And I put a couple other stats down here pertaining to that bin. So far it's received 12 feedings. Today will be its lucky 13th feeding. The younger of the two African nightcrawler containers we're going to be feeding today is, as of today, 69 days of age, which has so far received 8 feedings, and today will be its 9th. Then I've got some other stats here showing what the average interval between feedings on these containers are. Up until today's feeding, they were hovering around 7.8, 8.6. And after today's feeding, that average interval will come down to between 7 or 8 days between each feeding. So I'm going to get those bins out here on the bench, and we're going to give them a little bit of food. The food that I've got set aside for today sort of complies with my portioning of maybe 2 handfuls per bin, per feeding, per week. There's no rule. Trust me, I've got no rule. Maybe the best rule is that, hey, running out of room in the freezer, got to give some of this stuff to the worms. And stuff I don't keep in the freezer but is always on hand for the worms is the used coffee as well. So as needed, if I think it's needed, I can always pull the grit off the shelf, add a little bit of grit to go with the food, although I don't think it's necessary. I know the last feeding included grit. Last time we added bedding in each case, and that's what you're seeing here is the used coffee filters. So I was going to tear these up and throw them in with the feeding as a little bit of extra boost to the bedding in the bins. But last week too, the bins got a fair bit of bedding. Might not be necessary this time either. And the other notable thing from last week was that I had removed the plastic covers from each container because I was observing a fair bit of moisture in each bin. A lot of springtails, which is often an indicator of perhaps a bin that's too wet. And even little white spots, which some people suggested might be mold spores or something along those lines, some sort of fungus growing in there. So by having removed the plastic coverings that had been on there, my hope was that a little bit of the moisture in the bin would just evaporate away, helping drying the environment in these 2 bins, and we'll see how they're coming along today. So let's get to work. Now, the one thing that's a little bit of a shame when you don't have plastic coverings is that you don't have that little bit of a worm party greeting you when you first open the bin. So when there's plastic coverings, the moisture is recirculating, this paper is completely soaked. There's usually worms hanging out on top of this paper. And as we saw in last week's check-in on these bins, there was also a bunch of worm cocoons scattered on this paper too. So no worm party, no worm cocoons up here. No big deal. We're hoping that we've achieved the aim, which was to allow the bin to dry off a little bit and the moisture level to drop some. And I could tell just from looking at it, the moisture on the top here, on the surface, seems to have dropped a little bit, which is good. Definitely what I was after. And I guess once I've stirred this material together a little bit, that dry material going down low, combining with the more damp stuff that's below, will also help dry things a bit as well. Taking that into account as something that I can predict will happen after we stir things up here a little bit. I never really take a lot of time to look at individual worms, really. But you know, all the discussion about what type of worms these actually are has sort of piqued my interest a little bit, so I am kind of wondering if I can maybe even spot worms that are, you know, appearance-wise similar to what you would expect a African nightcrawler to look like. Appearance-wise, they're very dark in color, they're large in size, they have sort of an iridescent quality to their colors. But every time I look at the worms that are in these bins, I just don't get that sense that I'm looking at African nightcrawlers. And I think a lot of the viewers of the channel also tend to feel the same way too. That what we're looking at here is something else. Maybe just red wigglers. It's hard to say. Every now and then when I see a darker colored one, I feel like I want to pull it out and take a closer look. But then I start seeing its yellow tail. I notice that it's not very large in size. And I just don't get that feeling that what I'm looking at here is African nightcrawlers. So, I don't know. At some point I might just need to stop considering these as African nightcrawlers. Or maybe at some point I'll be able to, go picking through here and actually trying to see if I can find a couple that actually are. But I'm definitely starting to lean towards the bias that a lot of people seem to have, which tends to suggest that these are not African nightcrawlers. What we're seeing now are some of the items that had been added as part of the feeding last week. And, a lot of this white speckly stuff, I think probably might be grit, the crushed eggshell that I usually include in my feedings as grit. But like this stuff that's on here, on this fairly damp piece of tomato, to me this just does not seem like grit. This might actually be what somebody suggested, is that it might just be some sort of a mold growing or some sort of a fungus growing. I was growing a little paranoid. I was starting to wonder if maybe they're the eggs of some sort of an insect that had infiltrated the bin and, has pretty much laid enough eggs to take over the whole bin at this point. Because if each of these little white speckles was in fact an egg of some sort of an insect, boy, I would have to think that this is not going to be a worm bin at this point anymore. I would have to start considering it as some sort of an insect bin. A little bit surprised to find so many leftovers of the previous feeding in here. I know there were leaves, kind of the leaves of some sort of a vegetable added during the last feeding, and I believe that's what we're spotting here. And obviously the half of an avocado, half of a tomato that we already noticed. These pieces of paper bedding were also part of the feeding last week. So I'm not the type to pull away from the original game plan of adding more food to a bin. I usually prefer to just sort of follow through with that, regardless of whether or not I find scraps of leftovers from the last feeding. I'll still walk away from the experience as maybe, having had a lesson learned, and maybe coming back in here after another week's time is just a little bit too aggressive in terms of piling in even more food. But I don't want to pull away at this point. If I've already come down here with the food, I've already got the bin open, I'm prepared now with, all the makings of a feeding, there's not a lot of reason not to at this point. Granted, the material in the bin will end up sitting for a while before the worms finally break it down into worm castings, but that's okay, I don't mind so much. I'm kind of pleased to find the material in the bin, though, becoming a little bit less damp. It did seem like when I got to the bottom and I pulled material aside last time we were in here, I was seeing little pools of moisture collecting at the very bottom. And I think that was one of the main signs that told me that it was time to try to let this bin dry off a little bit. I definitely like the concentrations of worms I see pretty much everywhere. Good amounts of worms all over the place. I'm trying to remember what the estimate in my spreadsheet is. That's the one statistic I didn't write down on my little list over there on that thing that we looked at earlier. For some reason, I think I've got the number 500 in my mind. So for whatever reason, the estimate of how many worms are in this bin is somewhere in the neighborhood of 500, I believe. But, you know, just from looking at what's going on here, you know, if we did start out with 500 at some point not too long ago, I would have to guess that we're probably well above that at this point. This certainly does seem to me like a population that's in excess of 500 worms. So that's just an estimate, just a guess. So I'm not even sure about that. But I think we've given ourselves enough space here at the bottom of the container to drop in today's feeding. I like to put the feedings low, especially in a bin that's not so deep like this one. This is only a couple inches deep, so I want to have the food down low so any sort of insects that might be passing by don't get tempted to come nest in here. I definitely saw a couple little fruit flies here and there in the beginning, but not too many, not enough to get alarmed about, so I'm not worried, especially with only paper covering up here. I do like the progress we're making in terms of things drying out, but if all this white speckly stuff is in fact some sort of a mold growing, that would still mean that there's still maybe a little bit too much moisture in this bin. So it might make good sense to keep the paper as the only covering and leave the plastic off going forward maybe another week or so. And I think after we stir things around here, after we add the food, we can try to move some of the more damp material that's down at the bottom of the bin up a bit, and similarly move some of the drier stuff that we encountered at the very surface down into the lower reaches of the bin. So I'm just going to start assembling the feeding zone here. We did find a fair bit of paper left over from the bedding that had been placed in here last week. A lot of this shredded paper that we saw on our way down was stuff that I had placed in here last week. So it's going to require a little bit of time to break down. I think last week too we were trying to include a few of these used coffee filters. So I think we're probably going to see a few of those too. I think I might have saw a couple of those too when I was picking through here a little bit. So I always like to have a good amount of bedding underneath the feeding zone. I always know that my feedings, since they're frozen, are going to kick off moisture as the food thaws. And I like having stuff underneath there to capture that moisture. This is clearly a piece of coffee filter, one that was here last week already, or even prior to that. So I think that's more or less all the, oh, here's a little bit more or less all of the old and new bedding material that we could place the food on top of. Let's see here. I'm going to, similar stuff, right? Half of a tomato, half of an avocado. I think we'll save the half of avocado to put it into the younger bin, including the half of an avocado, including the avocado pit. Because this bin, approaching the 100-day age, I generally want to try to limit the types of materials that I put in here at this point. At this age, I do expect to be harvesting the castings out of the container soon. So I don't want to be putting stuff into the container here that that's going to take an excessive amount of time to break down. So even an avocado like this from a week ago, with that hard shell on the outside, you know, that's going to take a little bit of time for the worms to break down. So I probably wouldn't want to put another piece of avocado in here with its shell, for fear of not having enough time at this point for the shell to be broken down. But the tomato, all these leafy things, these bits of carrots, all that stuff I believe is stuff that has a pretty good chance of breaking down in a couple weeks' time. And who knows, in a couple weeks' time we might be at the point where we would decide that it's time to stop feeding this bin on a regular basis and allow the worms a little bit of time to really go through what remains in the bin, any sort of little scraps of leaves and sticks and stems and anything else that's in here that's not yet been broken down. And rather than getting fresh food, let them focus on all the old stuff in the bin that still needs their attention and needs to be broken down. Some of the stuff out here on the very edge is definitely getting a little bit drier too. So I think by stirring the stuff together this way, introducing some of the more dry material to the more damp material, we're probably getting to a much better state here. Almost making me wonder if it might make sense to cover up with plastic again. But you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep things uncovered here, let it continue airing out. And by doing so, a lot of the material right here on the surface is not going to get the attention that it deserves from the worms. The worms will stay below the surface where things are damp. Because as the surface dries out, the worms won't want to be there. And that's fine. I do want to allow just the overall average moisture level of the contents of this bin to continue drying, because it still feels a little bit more damp than it needs to be. But it's a good sign to see that the majority of the material is flaking off my glove and not sticking. And it was also a good sign that we didn't observe too many springtails in here either. So I think things are looking up. Definitely going in the direction I was hoping for. So we're going to continue with the countermeasures in the attempt at trying to get the moisture down in here as we had started last week. So I think we're done here in this bin. Let's move on to the other container, the 69-day-old container, and see how that one's coming along. Okay, here we've got a very similar story to what we saw in the previous container. This is just a rigid container as opposed to the other container, which is a VERMIBAG tote. But there too, the bag sits inside of a plastic bin, so it might not be benefiting from the breathability of the container as much as it could be. This piece of paper is definitely dry. Let's see if I can just scrape off some of the material that's adhering to it. And let's start checking out how the contents look. I think we've got a fairly similar situation here. The top surface has sort of a dry, crusty feel to it, and obviously no worms hanging out here. I could see a little flying insect right there, but not many. Very similar in terms of how things are looking in here. And that was, I think, to be expected, because they did have very similar appearances last week when we last checked in. So I'm kind of expecting similar progress. So I think they're going to track similarly to one another. At least I hope so. It was almost identical in terms of how they were handled, in terms of the feeding, in terms of the bedding and grit they received last week, everything. So we're going to see some commonalities here, right? One of the commonalities being this avocado, which really hasn't received a whole lot of attention yet. Maybe it just needs a little bit more time for it to get to that broken down level that the worms favor before the worms actually start ripping into it. Although in most cases you do see avocados get gobbled up pretty quickly in the worm bins. I'm trying to remember now which of the bins it was that I saw a lot of leftovers in. I thought it was the VERMIBAG, the one we fed previously. that we had seen a lot of leftovers in last week. And then we fed regardless. And we're kind of in that same situation here again, where we're seeing leftovers from the previous feeding, but it's not going to hold me back. It's not going to prevent me from adding more food to this bin, because the stuff we add today might not get approached a week from now or even 2 weeks from now. At that time, they might still be busy working on some of the materials that have already been in here a week. Sometimes things just require a little bit of patience. You got to give the material a chance to get to that broken down level that the worms are able to start taking advantage of it. Or maybe you've just got to give the worms a little bit of time to stop putting their focus on something else that's drawing their attention more than the stuff that's just sitting there waiting for their attention. So it does seem like there's numerous variables sometimes that influence the activity in a bin. Going right down here, we're able to see a little bit of standing moisture. And I can't remember if this bin might have been a little bit more damp than the other one we just tended to. Maybe because it's a solid plastic container rather than being a bag. Maybe it just doesn't have that ability to shed some of the moisture through the fabric container. Maybe that's why we're seeing a little bit more moisture down at the bottom here. But there's not really huge differences. I'm seeing similar quantities of leftover food, similar quantities of leftover paper and bedding type stuff from last week. But with the knowledge that this bin is younger and we'll probably have a little bit more time to break down the stuff that I put in it today, I feel okay putting in that avocado, knowing that that shell of the avocado will have a little bit more time to break down. So on younger bins, I'll usually include tougher, slower composting materials, knowing that there's adequate time for the stuff to get broken down. Here too, because the bin is younger, I think we're still seeing some more remnants of the materials that were used to originally build the bin, such as leaves, which I usually use early on in the bin's life cycle, but try to hold off on using later. Because I know that even though the leafy portions of the leaves get eaten up, their sticks and stems don't, and they take a little bit more time to get consumed. So we're seeing pretty similar progress in both of these bins. Which is part of the reason I like to manage bins in tandem, sort of do a buddy system in a way. Get the bins sort of in sync with one another in terms of how I'm managing them. And then if one starts doing something way different from the other, then a lot of times that's a good indicator of something that needs a little bit of attention, or something that's going good and something that, you know, you might want to mimic in the other bin. You know, even though, yeah, like I said, you're attempting to do things in sync with each other, so there shouldn't be a great deal of deviation between the bins if you're doing it that way. But yeah, I think there's certain benefits to having at least two bins that are being managed in a similar fashion to each other, so you can gain the benefit of comparing the progress of the bins to one another, at least if there's only two or more, whatever it is that you've got. So let's start reconstructing this feeding area here. So we could plop in today's portion. Same as we did in the Vermibag tote on the 94-day-old system. We're going to drop in these two filters. I'm going to try to make the pieces of paper a little bit smaller and try to crumble them up so they don't mat up against anything and become difficult to approach. It seems to me if the pieces of paper have somewhat more abstract shapes like this, they don't have the ability to sort of lay flat on the bottom or stick to each other as much as they would if they were just thrown in here as flat sheets of paper. So I try to crumble up paper if I can. Try to give it good exposure on all sides. Even here, if I'm seeing flat pieces of paper matting up against each other, I'll usually do my best to try to expose as much of the material to the surrounding stuff as possible by crumbling it up or tearing it up or spreading it out if I can. So the moisture level, I could feel it in the paper, is a little bit higher than we had in the last bin. But hopefully those few little pieces of dry paper we just dropped in, those little pieces of coffee filter, hopefully they'll suck up a little bit of the moisture. Let's see if we can just spread that out just a little bit. I mean, I like finding things that are intact still and really seeing the progress that the worms have made versus progress that has occurred from me breaking it up. So that's the reason I'll usually keep things relatively intact. Just so I could see what kind of progress the worms are making versus, progress that occurs from me ripping it to pieces. The pit of an avocado, I mean, if you've ever felt one, it's like a rock. It's hard as heck. But after a few weeks in a worm bin, you can pretty much crumble it between your fingers. A little bit surprising. So we'll see how long it takes for that to get to that stage. Let's see if I can remove some of these last little remnants of leafy material that I bought down here for them. I think it's a good enough feeding. There's a pretty good breakdown of how much I gave to this bin and how much I gave to the other bin. I think I saw a little bit more leftovers in here than I did in the other bin. So by giving this bin a slightly smaller amount of food, I think we're in pretty good balance. Kind of giving them feedings that are appropriate to the pace at which they're breaking stuff down. When we tilled up the outer edges of the Vermibag tote, we found little bits of dry material on the outskirts there. Here, the moisture level's a bit higher, so I'm hoping that by tilling it up this way, it's going to benefit from the aeration of being chunked up a little bit, and by moving some of the more damp stuff to the surface, it'll also have a chance to air out and dry off up here. Here and there, though, I'm trying to see if I could find scraps of old food, like this banana peel stem that I found on the way through this material. I just figured that sort of stuff I'd like to see down in the feeding area, as opposed to sitting out on the surface. Although it's a stem, I know it doesn't have that sweetness like the meaty part of the banana, so it might not draw pesky insects, but I don't know, just good habit, I think, to try to take old food scraps that you encounter at times like this and make sure that they're sunken down below the surface as opposed to sitting out on the top, especially if the coverings are going to be fairly minimal, as they're going to be in this container. Guess what I forgot to do? I did not give these worms even one little scrap of coffee at this point. And it's something I do all the time. Why is that? I must have tunnel vision or something. And it's at this point, I don't let myself make up for the mistake or the omission at this point. If I forgot about it, it's going to have to wait. That coffee's going to have to get fed to other worms elsewhere. Oh, I don't know why it cracks me up when I do that. It's just my trademark gaffe. All right, everyone. On that funny note, we're done here. So let me take a few minutes here to put things away and get things cleaned up. But I'm not going to bore you with that because that's boring. Let me just sign off now. But before I do, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care.